Hey, well, morning everyone. Welcome to St. Mary's. If we haven't met before, my name is Matt and I'm one of the leaders here. And this is the second part in a three-part series called Resilient Faith. So around 20 years ago or so, a guy called Laurence Gonzales wrote an award-winning book called Deep Survival: Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why. And it's a little over 300 pages of real-life case studies and narratives of people who found themselves in life-threatening situations and how they lived to tell the tale. Or didn't. And it's a mix of sort of adventure narratives, survival science, practical advice, and according to its jacket copy, has inspired everyone from business leaders, military officers, educators, psychiatric professionals on how to take control of stress, learn how to assess risk, and make better decisions under pressure. Now, I wouldn't want to spoil the book for you if you haven't read it, and it would be highly disrespectful to suggest that I could reduce a 300-page thesis down to 2 points, but here I am. Point 1. Everything eventually breaks, with or without warning. And 2, our actions now determine our survival in the future. Let me explain. Everything breaks with or without warning. He's talking about your motorboat engine when you're out to sea. He's talking about your GPS or your communication systems when you're out in the wilderness, or your climbing harness as you're halfway up a mountain. Freak accidents and the all too expected, everything eventually breaks. And of course, we know this ourselves, don't we? Global pandemics force us into isolation and purposelessness. Illnesses and life-altering conditions strike out of nowhere. Redundancy selections are announced. Loved ones die. Wars break out. Everything we know, everything that is our normal eventually breaks with or without warning. 2, our actions now determine our survival in the future. Preparation is absolutely vital. If you are caught in an avalanche, it is too late to Google what to do when you're caught in an avalanche. You have already made the decision about your survival. And I think the pandemic, for many of us, including the most privileged among us, exposed our lack of preparedness as anxieties soared, critical thinking declined, and families struggled to adapt. So Gonzales in the book, he says, we don't actually rise to the occasion when these situations come to face us, but we fall to the level of our training. And so if I were to Christianize this for a moment, when disaster strikes, as it inevitably will, we are unlikely to meet it where it's at. It's at this point, the strength of our discipleship, our practices, our training, and our patterns are revealed. So when Paul is writing his letters to Timothy, he's largely speaking about the false teachers who are running amok among the Ephesian church. But I think it applies to the situations in our life that may derail us. He says, for physical training is of some value, but godliness, other translations use the term spiritual training, has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life that is to come. And so there's a question for us to reflect on. Are we spiritually in training for whatever it may be that might break? Or do we overestimate our ability to handle these situations based on faith alone? When Jesus was challenged in the wilderness, he responded to the accuser's attempts to create doubt in God's provision and character by quoting Bible verses that he had known ever since he was a child. When his beloved friend Lazarus died, he made significant statements that revealed a profound theological understanding of his own identity. And when life dripped from his hands and poured out of his side as he died upon the cross, he quoted scriptures and he prayed prayers that he had known all of his life. Jesus had been preparing for the moment when things would go wrong. And really, that's what this series is about. It's about how do we have a resilient faith that is prepared for the difficulties, the doubts, and the disappointments that will inevitably come our way. And today, what I want to speak about is doubt. And to help us, we're going to read from John's Gospel, chapter 20, where we encounter the patron saint of all doubters himself, Thomas. So we're going to start now in verse 24. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen, yet have believed." It's one of those brilliant passages that by God's kindness has been included in the Bible because we need to know what to do with our doubt. One commentator has said of this passage that in more sort of theologically liberal communities, the approach towards doubt is often too soft. Sort of like the consequence of making ambiguity the status quo is that we fail to grow, we fail to move forward between those beyond these things, but also it's of no help to anyone who's in any place of pain or confusion. In contrast to this, more theologically conservative communities tend to be too hard on doubt, emphasizing the dire consequences of unresolved doubt, verging on a sort of spiritual perfectionism that leaves doubters in a place where they dare not reveal that they're experiencing doubt to anyone else, let alone themselves. Both of these two extremes are errors that we want to avoid. We want to take doubt seriously, but we also do not want to be afraid of doubt either. And I think our starting place should be that doubt is an inevitable part of life. Just as John said in his talk last week, if you haven't experienced desperate situations, perhaps because you're quite young, you will. Well, if you haven't doubted yet, you will. Look what happens to Thomas. Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." Have you ever arrived at church on a Sunday, the worship's kicking off, and everybody around you's worshiping, they've got their hands in the air, they're singing in tongues, they're falling over in the ministry time, and you're looking around going, "I'm not feeling anything at all." It's like the bus has driven past, but your arm's been hanging out waiting for it to stop, and everyone else is on the party bus. And you feel left out, and it can be painful if that happens. At least it feels like you've been left out. We also live in a society where doubting the spiritual is normalized and the role of faith is minimized. It's a harder context to believe in than in previous generations. As believers, we are often the minority within our friendship groups or even our colleagues at work. And of course, at other points in history, it was not hard to be, but we just don't live in a context that's like that anymore. Sometimes doubt creeps in because we've got a naive faith. It's not childlike, it's childish. We have this expectation that God will do what I want, when I want, and in the timing that I've asked him for. And when that doesn't happen, it causes a deep challenge within us. And of course, what we do is we throw ourselves upon God. We put all of our hopes onto him, and in his kindness, he often does meet us, which is amazing. It's amazing. I wonder if you've ever found yourself feeling cynical, say, towards church, faith, some of the stories that you might hear, share, just like we did a minute ago. I wonder if you've ever felt cynical, maybe now or in the past, whether in the past you were something of an idealist when it came to your faith. Sometimes people sort of project all of their hopes, all of their ideas onto God, and they can quickly become cynical when things don't pan out the way they expected. Sometimes meeting Christians from other places causes doubt within us because you wonder, well, why am I here? Am I here just because my values sort of meet sort of the theology of this place? And then you meet other people and you think, well, what if this isn't God's way? What if I'm going down a slightly wrong path? Or if you meet colleagues or friends of other religions and they just have a real sincerity about their faith, it makes you question, why am I not as zealous about my faith? Or even like, how could God possibly exclude these people who are so sincere in their faith? Sometimes doubts can come from the Bible, and I've spoken to some people, a couple of people this year where this has come up. One person came with real deep anxiety. They'd been raised as a Christian, and they had never thought about this question before. It was causing them a great deal of distress. The question, how did all the animals fit on the ark? It's only a boat. How big would that boat have to be? And what about the birds? Where did they go? And the dinosaurs? And it's shaken them, and it's like, well, can I even be a Christian anymore? I said, that's very understandable. It was just a very big boat. I didn't say that. But often, it's actually our personal circumstances, because everything eventually breaks. I thought that I'd be married by now. I thought my child or my friend or my parent would get well. I thought God was leading me in this direction, and I went, but now it's a dead end, or the options lay before me were just not what I expected. God, where are you in this? Our lives and expectations are shaken by doubt, and it can be a very difficult thing to go through. One of my favorite characters in the Bible is John the Baptist. He is an absolute hero. Profound sense of call on his life. He knows that he's chosen. The Holy Spirit filled him when he was in the womb, and then faithfully went on to lead the way and point people towards Jesus. Recognized Jesus for who he was. Said, no, I can't baptize you. You should be baptizing me, but then obediently does what is meant to be done. And later on in his life, he ends up in prison. And he sends a message with some of his followers to Jesus, which is, are you really the one? Are you really the one? He knows he's the one. He knows he's the one. He's the one who said, behold, the Lamb of God. He knows theologically that he's the one, but circumstantially, he needs to know that Jesus is the one. And Jesus confirms that he's the one. He says, look, all these signs that follow the Messiah, this is the kingdom of God breaking out as the king enters the scene. And he says, blessed are those who stick with me despite the challenges they face, even if my ways and my timings and my teaching do not line with their expectations. And as we know, John the Baptist never left that prison. Everybody doubts. It's part of the human condition. Do you know that atheists doubt every single day as well? There's a documentary called Collision that looks at new atheism, and particularly the story of Christopher Hitchens, who wrote a book called God is Not Great. And he described himself as being an anti-theist. So an atheist is somebody who doesn't believe in God, but sort of, kind of wishes that the idea of God was right. An anti-theist is someone who is relieved there is no evidence for such an assertion. Anyway, his great joy in life was going in one-on-one combat, as it were, with a fundamentalist Christian. And this documentary follows him. And at the very end of the documentary, a journalist or the narrator asks the question, are there any theistic arguments that are actually compelling to you? And he thinks to himself for a moment, and he goes, well, maybe like the fine-tuning of the universe. Like if our planet, this Earth, was just like 100 miles this way or 100 miles that way, there would be no ecosystem, no humans, no life, no history. It does sort of have the appearance that it was all strategically put together to produce this. But it doesn't prove there's a creator, but it is something that you have to wrestle with. Even the most ardent non-believer and anti-theist can still be tempted by faith. We just don't have all of the information. There's so much that we don't know. And so we have to approach these things with humility because everybody is groping their way towards the light. So point 1, doubt is inevitable. Point 2, you must wrestle with the doubts that come your way. Look at what Thomas says. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Now, Thomas is a follower of Jesus. He's a disciple. So at some point along the way, Jesus has picked him up and he has left everything, family, job, to follow this wandering preacher man for 3 years. And now what he knows is that this guy is dead. All of Jerusalem knows he's dead. And the disciples are saying, hey, we've seen him. And what he's saying to the disciples is like, I do not have a frame of reference for what you're talking about right now. You do know that dead men don't rise, don't you? And so if you're going to ask me to go all in, again, like I have just been doing for the last 3 years, I'm going to need some very tangible evidence. It can be extremely painful and disorientating process to go through and process our trauma or our childhood upbringing or just the gnawing doubts that go behind the scenes. And we just can't assume that God's goodness or his promises or the teaching that we received at children means that we can avoid it. Everything eventually breaks, and the crisis will reveal what is within us. Paul says this to the church in Philippi, that we are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Now, of course, that does not mean that salvation is achieved through our own works or our own effort. The Bible is consistent in teaching that salvation is by grace through faith. But Paul is saying that there's this ongoing process where we work out our faith in humility and in awe and taking responsibility that we would live a life of grace as we have received it from God. If our faith is going to be real, if it's going to be deep, if it's going to be robust, if it's going to be resilient, we're going to have to wrestle with doubt. There is no road to spiritual maturity that doesn't go through it. You have to go through it. You can't go around it. Okay, let's talk about faith. Just as everybody doubts, everybody is trusting in something. We all have faith. As you all know, I wasn't here. In fact, if you were here last week, you'll know that I wasn't here last week to do this talk because I was on death's door. Thank you so much for your kind messages of love and concern. Mum, if you're listening on the podcast. She's not listening on the podcast. When Pip went to the pharmacy for me this week to get me drugs, she didn't check the pills that were in the bottle. She didn't ask the doctor for a second opinion. She just handed them to me, and I chugged them down like they were going to save my life. I didn't think that they might actually do me any harm. The level of faith that is required to navigate any typical day is extremely high. All of us are exercising faith all of the time, but it's not a bad thing. But the next question after that is, why should we exercise faith in Jesus Christ? Let's think about dating just for a moment. It is, in fact, the experience of uncertainty that makes possible the euphoria of what we call falling in love. We go through this sort of intense questioning, wondering, hoping, doubting. Does he like me? Does he not like me? Does he care? Does he even know I exist? And then that's followed, hopefully, by evidence that he or she does care. And we have this endorphin tidal wave. And it's precisely this roller coaster ride of the agony of the uncertainty and the ecstasy of relief that gives the early stages of their emotional energy. It's basically like love dynamite. And also, it's also why love, as it matures, as commitment becomes more sure, the roller coaster ride must inevitably settle down. Faith, I think, is so often misunderstood as just holding a set of beliefs. Many people think, perhaps you've been coming to church for a long time or dragged along by somebody else. Well, I just don't know if I believe in the God you're talking about. I'm not sure if I believe in the authority of the Scripture. I mean, I might get on board with love being the highest virtue, but that's sort of where we're at. And if I can't hold these things, then I can't necessarily move forward. But at its core, faith is not simply the belief in a statement. It puts trust in a person. We all think that we want certainty, but we don't. What we really want is trust placed wisely in another. And I think that this really is the very heart, is everything that John in his gospel wants to communicate to his readers and the people in his community. John at no point uses the noun faith. Doesn't use it once, but he says to believe about 100 times, just as Paul does multiple times in his letters as well. John, the gospel writer, is not interested in you believing things about Jesus or having the right thoughts about him. He's not that interested in you doing the right Christian things either, behaving like a Christian or having a Christian worldview. He is interested in you believing in the person, the risen Christ. His interest is in you experiencing and encountering the risen Christ. And so as he writes his gospel, he's going to show you all the things that Jesus is capable of doing. His power over nature, his power over sin, his power over systems, in human systems. He's going to talk about the signs that Jesus did. Through his gospel, what he wants to do is expose you to this person called Jesus. He wants you to know that Jesus, God, has broken in. He has become flesh and moved into the neighborhood, as the message puts it. He dwells among us. He's entered into an uncertain world with all of its violence and its mistrust, and he's come so close that humans could touch his very hands, see his eyes, listen to his voice, feel his breath against their face. And by his Spirit, you and I can hear him, you and I can feel him, you and I can meet him too. This is what John wants us to know. And so in spite of all of the doubts and the challenges of this world, the figure of Jesus has been historically very difficult to get rid of or to jettison. There was an article only a couple of weeks ago about a new atheist, but in the sort of the Muslim end of the perspective. It's on the Unheard website, if you ever sort of read that blog, who's come to faith and has just found it difficult to lose Jesus. It's very difficult to get rid of Jesus. Historically, it's very difficult to get rid of Jesus personally as well. You might say it's impossible to kill him. He just keeps on resurrecting and remaining. And quietly and emphatically, he just makes himself known among people. Even amongst all of our self-related nonsense, he just refuses to disappear. He's just there, knocking on the door of our hearts, knock, 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 if we'd only let him in. And so here at St. Mary's, what we seek to do, in a somewhat flawed, haphazard, but a well-meaning way, is not just to believe the right things about God and Christianity, not just to do the right things within Christianity as well, as important as those things are, and of course following Jesus is important, but what we seek to do is to meet with Jesus, day in, day out, week in, week out, through worship, through prayer, through the Bible, through the ministry time at the end of our service, and we ask Jesus to come right into the center of our lives, to meet with an actual person, and we ask him to be Lord. I could give you I can give you countless historical, logical, emotional, rational arguments for why believing in Jesus is a good thing. How putting faith in him isn't just a blind punt on a hazy myth. And these arguments can be really good. They can be really helpful for strengthening our faith. As you know, my own story of becoming a Christian was through this way. It was through reason, through assessing the sort of the historical weight and evidence behind the resurrection. But no argument is going to change someone's life. No argument will change someone's life. Jesus did not take on flesh so that we would be convinced by him. He did it that we would meet him. And this is the purpose of human existence, not just to meet with him, but actually to have the courage to allow him to come and meet with us, to let his life and his power change us from the inside out. And so we can bring our doubts and our fears, our uncertainties, our history, our hopes, everything good, bad, and ugly to him. And as we do that, he will change us, and he will heal us and strengthen us and challenge us, and he will fill us with his goodness. This is what we as a church want to do, make space for that. It's what Jesus is here to do for every single one of us. And so I think that John would say to each of us as we read through his gospel, just don't be afraid. Do not be afraid of the state of this world. Don't be afraid of the state of the church, the state of your faith. Don't be put off by your past or your present or your future, the questions or the doubts that sort of be lingering, all your uncertainties. Do not be afraid, because Jesus is here. Jesus is here. Let us instead welcome him in and let us worship him. And this is what happens in the Thomas story as well. Jesus responds. He shows up and he gives them exactly what he needs for the rest of the journey. Peace be with you. In your unbelief, in your disorientation, in your uncertainty of your future, peace be with you, is Jesus' words to him. Do you want to see? Do you want to see? Here's my hands, here's my feet. And Thomas's response is to worship my Lord and my God. He is the first person to see Jesus on the other side of doubt, and he worships him. He's able to truly say, you are my Lord and my God. And it only comes through the wrestling of doubt, not through some sort of shallow acknowledgement that Jesus is a historical figure in the past. God, in his mercy, met Thomas exactly where he needed to be met in a way that made sense to him. So, to end, how do we see Jesus through our doubts? Or perhaps going back to the second point from Gonzalez's book, what actions can we put in place now that will determine our survival in the future? Firstly, we need to be really honest about where we are. Sometimes in churches like ours, for some really strange reason, people find it very difficult to talk about their doubt. But maybe it's better that we just bring our doubt into the center. This is a church that does try to be real about a lot of things. We can talk about stuff. If you've seen our information desk there, we run courses for married couples, premarital couples, parenting teenagers, parenting infants. We have a money course, people struggling with money, social supermarket. Not that these courses are especially important, good as they are. They just represent the fact that in life, some of us face challenges and we need some help. Or we don't necessarily have all the answers to everything that we're going through. We will not be overwhelmed by your doubts. I think sometimes people feel worried they're going to sort of pollute the ecosystem of the church if they sort of air them. It's going to be okay. We're going to walk with you, and I would encourage you to be part of a small group so you can find other people to share these things with. Do the life course in January. One of the best things about doing the life course, if you are already a believer, is being in a group of other believers where you can air the questions that you think you're the only person who's ever concerned about, and you realize that you're not. And so you can air those in a safe environment with like-minded people. You can also be reminded of some intellectually satisfying Christian truths that you've heard before, but it's good to be reminded of them again. And you can also do the thing you were made for and allow for Jesus by his Spirit to meet you. Yes. This could be very, very hard, but stay the course. 2, choose to put your focus on Jesus. And we're encouraged by the writer to the Hebrews to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus so that we won't lose heart. You could focus on your struggles, you could focus on your problems, you could focus on lots of other things, but I would encourage you to fix your eyes on Jesus. You know how when Peter is walking on water and he takes a step out of the boat and he's got his eyes on Jesus and it's fine, but then he becomes aware of the wind and the waves and the swell going around him. He takes his eyes off Jesus and he starts to sink. When we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, we're not sort of putting the blinkers on and basically trying to sort of deny that there's actually a storm going on. We're just choosing where our focus goes in the midst of the conditions. How do we keep our focus on Jesus, our eyes on Jesus? We've got to read the Gospels. We've got to read the Gospels, keep coming back to the Gospels. I know everybody will have their own sort of version of how to read the Bible. Some people swear by doing the Bible in 1 year. That's way too much reading for me personally. It's good to read the whole Bible. The whole Bible is good. You just don't have to do it in a year, in my opinion. I think what would be good is for us to keep coming back to the Gospels regularly, to allow the lives of Jesus to speak to us again. We daily need his comfort and his challenge that comes by reading the Bible, but reading the Gospels. Sometimes we're sort of living on the memory, what we remember that the gospel is saying, as opposed to what the gospels have said to us that particular day. If you don't know how to do this, just take 5 minutes in the morning, somewhere quiet, and ask the Spirit to speak to you, to reveal Jesus to you as you read a short passage from the Gospels. Don't read a whole chapter, just read one header to the next header. Spirit, speak to me, reveal Jesus. Read the header. Don't worry about the things you don't understand. Focus on the bits that you do understand, and then turn that bit into a prayer. Ask Jesus to come and meet you and help you with the rest of your day. Keep your eyes fixed on him. 3, be embedded in community. Yes, faith is personal, but it's also a communal task that we do together. Encourage one another daily. Another bit from Hebrews there. The Bible has no concept for someone who just floats around disconnected from a Christian community. If you choose to isolate yourself away from the people of faith, then you are basically setting yourself up for a future of doubt. Nobody's faith is strong enough to go it alone. And finally, know that it just doesn't all depend on you. Your faith isn't strong because it feels strong. Your faith is strong because Jesus is holding you. I think it's so unfair that Thomas, for eternity, is called Doubting Thomas. Because this one moment in this Gospels shouldn't necessarily be the thing that defines him forever, any more than our doubts should define us forever either. After this encounter with Jesus, he went off to India to spread the gospel. He's not a doubter. He doubted. He was faithful. He was a missionary. He was a disciple. He was an apostle. He was a martyr. He was a man of great faith. And so for you too, regardless of where you are, faith is where you are headed. Paul says, the Lord who has started a good work in you will bring that to completion. It may not feel like that right now if you are wrestling with doubt, but I want you to know that you are not forgotten. This is not the end of your story. Amen.